Welcome back to ATM 5, our changing atmosphere. In today's lecture, we're applying the principles of atmospheric dynamics to the global atmosphere. This lets us understand the general circulation and the drivers behind weather in the mid-latitudes. In this lecture, we'll be defining intertropical convergence zone, Hadley cell, jet streams, extratropical cyclones, and weather fronts. We'll be asking, what are the major drivers of global air movements? What are the major atmospheric patterns in the general circulation? And what are the major features of mid-latitudinal weather? As discussed last time, weather is primarily driven by differences in temperature across the globe. Here we see a map of global average surface temperature that emphasizes the strong gradients in temperature that exist between equator and pole. Weather is the reaction of the natural environment to those differences and will be responsible for redistributing energy from the equatorial regions poleward. Earlier in this class, we talked about convection of air. Namely, we aim to understand what happens to an air parcel that is warmer than its environment. Where is surface warming strongest on this plot? With that answer in mind, where do you expect convective activity or rising motion to be the strongest? Yes, convective uplift of air will be strongest where there is the greatest amount of surface warming. In this case, that occurs near the equator, where surface temperatures are the highest. So what does that look like? Well, we have warm, moist air at the equatorial surface that is heated and becomes warmer than its surrounding environment. This triggers a convective updraft that is also responsible for carrying moisture upward. As that air expands and cools, the water in the air condenses, producing cloud droplets and rain droplets. By the time that air hits the tropopause, it is relatively dry as the moisture has been squeezed out. The air cannot rise any farther since the air above is warmer and thus stable. Unable to rise farther, the air spreads out laterally, away from the equator and towards the poles. We say that air in this region diverges from the equator. However, if this were the only image that mattered, air would quickly vacate the equator, leaving none left to breathe at the surface. Consequently, there must be a way for the air to come back down once it's hit the tropopause. As air moves away from the equator, it radiates away heat and thus cools. Air that cools will naturally sink down to the surface. As the air is initially dry and undergoes expansion and warming as it descends, the resulting air is far from saturation and actually suppresses convection in these descending regions. Consequently, in this region, where the air descends, there tends to be very little precipitation and very little upward motion. Finally, to close the cycle, air must return to the equator to replace the air that was removed through convection. The result is near-surface convergence of air. In the process of moving along the planet's surface, warm ocean waters produce evaporation, which moisten the air as it returns. The result is moist air by the equator that can again go through this cycle. The result of this whole system is a Hadley cell in each hemisphere, which we'll return to shortly. This region of convergence, where convective motion is commonplace, is known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITCZ. As the temperature maximum follows the sun over the course of a year, so does the ITCZ. In July, the ITCZ tends to be slightly north of the equator, although the exact position varies because of land masses. In January, the ITCZ tends to be slightly south of the equator, although again the exact position varies depending on where on the globe you are. As mentioned, convective motion is commonplace over the ITCZ, driven by strong surface warming and convergence of air from the north and south. Rising air lowers the surface density and produces a region of relatively low surface pressure that acts to draw in air from its surroundings. The ITCZ is clearly seen in this satellite image of the Earth, as convective activity in this region makes the ITCZ far cloudier than its surroundings. The weak Coriolis force in this region also means that air tends to not rotate much, instead producing tall cumulonimbus towers and clearly distinguishing itself from weather on other places of the Earth. Here's another depiction of the Hadley circulation in each hemisphere. Rising motion along the ITCZ produces significant convection and precipitation in this region. This leads to divergence at the top of the troposphere, sinking motion away from the ITCZ, and convergence of air towards the ITCZ. The region of rising motion tends to be narrower than the region of subsidence. Intuitively, this framing would seem to suggest a single-cell circulation model like the one depicted here, namely rising motion at the equator, divergence towards the two poles, and sinking motion in the subpolar to polar latitudes before air returns to the equator. Such a model would imply that air essentially travels directly between the equator and poles, in both directions. Unfortunately, this simplified model is complicated by the rotation of the planet. As air heads from equator to pole, the Coriolis force turns it to the east, stymieing its attempts to carry that warm air directly to the pole. The result is that air instead moves from west to east once it reaches the subtropics, at a latitude of around 30 degrees in both hemispheres. This gives rise to what is known as the subtropical jet stream, a feature we'll discuss in a bit. With air unable to go directly from equator to pole, a more complicated circulation emerges. On the Earth, instead of air descending at the poles, instead it descends in the subtropics, around 30 degrees north and south. This sets up a secondary circulation known as the Ferrel cell that stretches from approximately 30 degrees to 60 degrees latitude in both hemispheres, and a tertiary circulation known as the polar cell that circulates air between 60 degrees latitude and the poles. The result is 6 total circulation cells, 3 in each hemisphere. Thus, for the Earth, we can define the Hadley cell as a large-scale atmospheric convection cell in which air rises at the equator and sinks in the subtropics, typically around 30 degrees north or south. Again, the exact position of the rising air and sinking air vary depending on the season. Where that air rises and sinks determines where precipitation is enhanced and where it is suppressed. The Hadley cell is one of the most important mechanisms for transport of heat from equatorial regions to the subtropics. From there, midlatitudinal weather is needed to carry that heat farther poleward, and we'll touch on how it does that later in this lecture. Here we have a three-dimensional view of the general circulation. As mentioned before, the northern and southern hemisphere Hadley cells are particularly important for enhancing uplift along the ITCZ and producing divergence near the tropopause. As that air moves poleward, it is pushed to the east by the Coriolis force, driving a region of strong eastward winds at 30 degrees north and south, known as the subtropical jet stream. Around this region, we also have sinking air, which suppresses precipitation and consequently is important in making these latitudes particularly dry. The returning branch of the Hadley circulation along the surface brings air from the subtropics back to the equator. These winds are known as the trade winds, as they were important for governing ship travel across the ocean. As the trade winds are turned by Coriolis force on their return to the equator, they generate westward motion near the equatorial surface. Thus, air around the equator blows from east to west. Here we see yet another view of the general circulation. The top figure here shows wind direction at the top of the troposphere. We see weak winds around the equator with divergence to the north and south. In the mid-latitudes, we see strong flow towards the east, a region known as the midlatitudinal westerlies. Away from the equator, almost all wind in the upper troposphere is to the east. The bottom figure here shows near-surface flow. Here, winds are far more random because they are strongly tied to topographic features. That is, friction plays a big role in affecting wind speeds. However, in regions where there is little topography, such as in the Antarctic circumpolar jet, at the bottom of this figure, we again see strong eastward flow. Nonetheless, even in the northern hemisphere, it is clear that most flow north of 30 degrees is from the west. Near the equator, the converging air is pushed towards the west, producing a generally westward flow. The variation in wind direction at the near surface was important for shipping in the past, particularly the transatlantic trade. Sailing vessels would navigate south to 20 degrees latitude before crossing the Atlantic, taking advantage of the favorable trade winds that pushed them to the west. On return to Europe, these ships would instead head north, where winds tended to blow from the west, and so giving them an easier time to cross. The large-scale movement of air is also responsible for the transport of moisture in the atmosphere. As discussed already, rising motion at the ITCZ is responsible for driving uplift, that in turn drives precipitation in this region. This rising motion produces a region of relatively low pressure as air is drawn upward. When the air sinks back down in the subtropics, it suppresses uplift, and hence precipitation, and compresses the near-surface air, producing relatively high-pressure regions. In the mid-latitudes, air is lifted up by frontal systems and topography to produce some regions of relatively wet conditions. Then air that is lifted in the mid-latitudes and transported poleward descends in this region, producing dry conditions over the poles. As mentioned before, lifting in the mid-latitudes is primarily provided by topographic uplift and frontal systems, which we'll touch on later. So how do we anticipate the general circulation will be affected by climate change? Well, we know that higher temperatures will tend to lead to more vigorous convection, particularly along the ITCZ. This results in a stronger Hadley circulation, which can produce an expansion in the subsidence region, that is, the region where air sinks from aloft. If these regions expand, then we also anticipate that the deserts of the world will expand. This has important implications for many regions of the world, particularly southern Spain and the Sahel region of Africa. But notably, the southern edge of California lies along 30 degrees north. A more vigorous Hadley circulation would be a major driver in exacerbating drying in this region and throughout the U.S. Southwest. This map shows us which regions of the world are at greatest risk for desertification. Those areas at most risk can generally be found around the edges of existing deserts, in line with expectations of expansions in desert regions. Regions of pronounced risk include the southwest U.S. and the edges of the Sahara, Kalahari, and Australian deserts. However, the Middle East is at particular risk of massive desertification, with temperatures in some locations rising above the level of what is considered habitable. Now that we've examined the general circulation and understood some of the expected changes for the tropics and subtropics, let's move poleward and into the mid-latitudes. The weather here is qualitatively different than the weather of the tropics, and so it's not surprising that climate change may manifest in different ways. Here's our view of the general circulation. We've examined most aspects of this so far, but let's turn our attention to the lower troposphere north of the subtropics. Here the winds are dominated by flow from the west, that is, westerlies, which carry large extratropical storms called extratropical cyclones. These storms are the primary driver for weather in the mid-latitudes. They are responsible for mixing of cold air from the north with warm air to the south, in the process producing warm and cold frontal systems. With 3 circulation cells in each hemisphere, jet streams naturally develop at the boundaries between these regions. Jet streams are fast-flowing, narrow, meandering air currents in the atmosphere. The subtropical jets appear at the confluence of the Hadley and Ferrel cells in each hemisphere. The polar jets appear at the confluence of the polar and Ferrel cells in each hemisphere. Both are found generally at the top of the troposphere, with wind speeds generally increasing with altitude. As with the circulation cells, the position of these jets shift seasonally, moving north in the northern hemisphere summer and south in the northern hemisphere winter. The airspeed within these jets can be more than 400 kilometers per hour, or 250 miles per hour. Jet streams are very important for air travel, as they greatly shorten travel times from west to east and increase travel time from east to west. The figure here shows a cross-section through the Earth's atmosphere, so you can get a better view of where these jets are located, in between the circulation cells at the top of the troposphere. As shown in the previous picture, this view is pretty idealized. Although the jets, on average, are found at 30 degrees and 60 degrees latitude, they trace out a wave-like pattern as they wind around the planet. Jet streams are closely connected with their neighboring circulation cells. The subtropical jet is the product of the Hadley cell, produced because of air that diverges from the equator and is turned eastward by the Coriolis force. A more vigorous Hadley circulation, that is, more convection and more diverging flow, tends to produce a stronger subtropical jet. The polar jet, on the other hand, emerges because of strong temperature differences between the mid-latitudes and the polar regions. When air mixes between these two regions, sharp changes in temperature can emerge that are associated with strong winds. The polar jet is most prominent in the winter season, when temperature differences between the mid-latitudes and poles are the strongest, and is a major driver of extreme wintertime weather. I've already mentioned extratropical cyclones a few times. Here's a satellite image showing one such extratropical cyclone. In this image, you can clearly see how these are rotating features, drawing warm, moist air from the south along their eastern flank, and cold, dry air from the north along their western flank. Formally, extratropical cyclones are large-scale, rotating meteorological systems that appear in the mid-latitudes and arise due to instabilities in the mean flow. That is, they arise naturally out of the jet streams and act as a mechanism for transporting heat poleward. This mixing action is important for driving weather in the mid-latitudes, including much wintertime extreme weather. Notably, the direction of rotation of these systems is consistent. In the northern hemisphere, these systems always rotate in the counterclockwise direction. In the southern hemisphere, they rotate in the clockwise direction. How do these extratropical cyclones form? In fact, they emerge because of the west-to-east jet stream pattern that naturally arises from a balance between the north-south pressure gradient and Coriolis forces. Recall from the lecture last time, this balance is known as the geostrophic wind. It dictates that air parcels in the northern hemisphere will naturally move with low pressure to the left and high pressure to the right. Because in the mid-latitudes pressure tends to decrease as one moves towards the poles, this gives rise to a natural west-to-east circulation. This pattern, however, does not allow cold air in the north to mix with warmer air from the south, and so can produce very strong temperature gradients. This arrangement is apt to collapse once that temperature differential becomes too large. In this image, we see one such instability forming. An emerging trough to the right-hand side comes about because of natural oscillations in the path of the jet stream. As this pattern grows, we see the wave stretching deeper towards the equator, bringing with it cold Arctic air. Much like breaking waves in the ocean, these troughs detach and form rotational systems known as extratropical cyclones. As you can see, the north-south flow around each flank of the tropical cyclones then acts to exchange cold and warm air. As cold air moves southward, it pushes into warm air, producing what is known as a cold front. As warm air moves northward, it pushes into cold air, producing a warm front. In this weather map, an extratropical cyclone is located around the L, here indicative of low pressure of the cyclonic system. The cold air is pushing to the southeast, lifting the moist warm air and producing precipitation. The cold front is indicated with the barbed blue line on this map. Similarly, to the east, this warm front, that is, the edge of warm air, is moving northward, with warm, moist air moving above cold and producing precipitation. The warm front is indicated with a cupped red line on this map. As discussed previously, air movement around the low is in the counterclockwise direction. Formally, weather fronts here are boundaries that separate two masses of air with different densities. It turns out that these frontal systems and their associated extratropical cyclones are the principal drivers of weather outside of the tropics. Here's an idealized depiction of one such cold front moving over land. As the cold air pushes into the warm, moist air, it is vigorously lifted and is responsible for producing cumulonimbus towers and other strong storms along its edge. These cold fronts tend to be vertically steep, and because of their bulldozer-like shape, tend to travel faster than warm fronts, easily moving the less dense air out of the way. Warm fronts, on the other hand, tend to be more wedge-shaped, as the cold air is more dense and hence harder to push aside. The warm air is more buoyant than the cold air, and so rises gradually above it. This produces a long cloud deck at varying altitudes, consisting of nimbostratus clouds at the lowest elevation, altostratus in the mid-troposphere, and cirrostratus and cirrus clouds at altitude. These fronts tend to be broader in shape than cold fronts and move more slowly, with precipitation spread over a larger distance. On this meteorological map, the extratropical cyclone is situated over Minnesota. It will slowly propagate eastward as it's pushed by the storm track. A cold front moves to the southeast along with its partner warm front moving to the north. Flow will be counterclockwise around the low in accordance with geostrophic balance. Cold air displaces the moist warm air, producing precipitation along its edge. Warm air rises above the cold air to the east of the low. The resulting mixing action produced by these extratropical cyclones is effective then in carrying energy from the south to the north, driving up temperatures in the subpolar and polar regions, and driving down temperatures to the south. When these cyclones are particularly strong, cold Arctic air can be driven far south, leading to freezing conditions that have the potential to damage infrastructure and crops. Strong wintertime storms are also associated with powerful blizzards, ice storms, and other forms of extreme wintertime weather. So what effect do we anticipate climate change will have on mid-latitudinal weather? Well, as mentioned earlier, these extratropical cyclones and associated frontal systems are the primary driver of weather in the mid-latitudes. When temperature differences are weaker between the mid-latitudes and the poles, the jet stream tends to oscillate more strongly. Similarly, significant temperature differences are associated with a strong jet stream that does not wind much. As we've discussed in class, we anticipate the Arctic to warm faster than the mid-latitudes. Consequently, the temperature difference between these two regions is expected to drop in response to climate change and produce a generally windier jet stream. This can in turn lead to more cold polar air being permitted to enter the mid-latitudes, and similarly warm air permitted into the Arctic. The result is, somewhat contradictory to expectations, more frequent and severe wintertime freeze events in the mid-latitudes, and simultaneous greater sea ice melt in the Arctic. This feedback then works to further weaken the polar jet stream. So next time somebody says that these cold blast events disprove climate change, be aware that the opposite is likely true. A second feature expected under climate change is an enhancement in the moisture, size, and intensity of atmospheric river events. Atmospheric rivers are narrow filaments of moisture that connect the subtropics to the mid-latitudes and are responsible for bringing rain to California. An enhanced subtropical jet that emerges in response to a more vigorous Hadley circulation may bring with it a greater risk of flooding. Okay, that's plenty for today. This lecture wraps up our material tackling the core physical science of climate change. In the next lecture, we'll be applying some of these concepts to understand the drought in California and how these drought events might be changing into the future.